Every life begins midweave, not a blank page, but thread and grief. Some threads shimmer, some hang loose, some are worn, but still hold true. In fabric the wear was quiet and deep, in thread the thoughts began to creep. In needle the plan took shape unseen, in tip the cloth split at the seam. Then came mend, a thread return, and flow where hope is slowly learned. Each step a shift, a sign, a scene, each one part of something unseen. Fabric frays, thread begins, needle sharpens, tip breaks in. Mend remembers, flow breathes on, and through it all we stay drawn. Not to fix or force or bloom, but just to sit beside the loom. We are not the weavers of their cloth, but hands that notice what was lost. We don't tug the thread too tight, we don't push away the night. We ask what hurts and why does it hurt so much? What mattered once and can we still touch? That thread, that meaning, that silent flame. The pain's not weakness, it speaks of name. The fragile thread, the quiet sigh, the thread through needle's narrowing eye. The tip, the tear, the breath that stayed, the stitch that healed, the hand that laid, the plan, the pull, the thread that bends, the silent signs that someone sends. They're not a mystery to decode, but signs of something once bestowed. Fabric tear, the needles pull, tip sharp point, then men made whole. Flow continues, still unsure, but still alive, still searching more. And us we walk, not far, not fast, but with the thread that still holds past. We listen not to fix or prove, we simply sit beside the loom. To honor what was torn, to follow what still matters, to trace a thread with care, not shatter, to stitch beside, not stitch for them. This is not the end. This is when the real work starts of holding heart.
Welcome back to the Protect podcast, where we are exploring steps for hope. This is season 4, episode 8. Over the past 7 episodes, we have walked with Ari through the full arc of the steps framework, from the first silent strains of vulnerability to the rupture of an attempt to the slow reweaving of life afterwards. This episode, it's different. It's a pause, a chance to look back, to gather the threads, to see the tapestry as a whole. Because steps is not just about phases, it's about patterns. The way threads wear, fray, tear, and mend. The way suicidal pain is never a straight line, but a shifting weave of risk, resilience, and meaning. But before we retrace the steps, we need to speak about the space between two people, the interview itself. Because no framework works if the room isn't safe, and no assessment helps if it isn't clear. This is the paradox we hold. The heart needs a story to unfold, the brain needs enough precision to make good decisions. If we overprivilege one, the other goes hungry, and the care becomes lopsided. So we need to take a moment to pause and think about what we mean by relational safety, which is at the heart of the Protect Suicide Prevention Training Framework. So relational safety isn't a checklist. It is a felt sense created by presence, tone, pacing, and transparency. It's the moment a person realizes, I can say it out loud and you won't flinch. It's built when we validate the pain before we evaluate the risk. Without this ground, detailed questions feel like intrusion. With it, curiosity is felt as care. So, how do we name the frame? What kind of words could work which can serve as a script? So, you can say something like, I want to understand your story in your words. I'll also ask some detailed questions, not to interrogate you, but so we can decide together what support will be safest and most helpful next. I will go at your pace and I will explain why I am asking as we go. This level of transparency turns inquiry into respect. So this is the balanced stance, heart and brain, story and structure. And there's always a balance we are trying to hold in these conversations. On the one hand is the heart, the space for story, for validation, for compassionate pacing, for choice. On the other hand is the brain, the need for clarity, for markers that help us understand equity and change. We need to know about the frequency and intensity of suicidal thoughts, how long they last, whether they can be controlled, whether means are accessible, if there have been rehearsals or past attempt, and what the person's intent looks like right now. We went through these topics as we were covering fabric, thread, needles, so on. Neither side is enough on its own, the heart or the brain. The story without structure risks leaving us moved but unclear. The structure without story risks leaving us informed but disconnected. The story is the data with a soul. The structure is the map we can act on. One way of holding this balance is to lean on the spirit of motivational interviewing. We have touched on these techniques and strategies as we have been covering the different topics. Think of it as our conversational posture. We ask open questions gently, so ambivalence has room to breathe. What's been on your mind most this week? Or when did things start to feel unmanageable? So these are open questions. We offer affirmations that are specific and believable and genuine, never exaggerated. You still showed up today, despite how depleted you feel. That's real effort. We reflect back ambivalence without judgment. Part of you wants relief at any cost, and part of you is still scanning for reasons to stay. So that's a double-sided reflection. And then we bring it together in summaries that integrate the push and pull. I'm hearing pain, exhaustion, and also a thread that wants support. Did I get that right? Done this way, motivational interviewing keeps curiosity warm and resistance low. It allows us to listen with compassion while still gathering what we need to make wise decisions. So these are two complementary threads that I want to talk about now. The narrative method and validity techniques. We have touched on both as we have been going through the different steps. So, two complementary methods, right? And we often weave them together when sitting with someone in suicidal distress. So the narrative method and what we call the validity techniques, I guess the narrative method comes very naturally to most people. It's the heart of the conversation. Instead of leading with a checklist or a form, we simply offer the mic. In your own words, would you share what led up to this point? Start anywhere. It's your story. And then we listen. We don't rush. We let the story take shape in its own rhythm. Because in that story is not just pain, there is meaning. Often after we have honored that narrative, only after trust has begun to form do we pivot. And we do it transparently. Thank you for trusting me with that. There are a few specific things I need to ask to make sure you're safe. Would it be okay if we went there now? So, when framed in this way, the shift doesn't feel like an interrogation. It feels like a continuation of care. This is where validity techniques come in. They are not cold tools. They can be framed in a very gentle way, transparent, purposeful ways of filling in the parts of the jigsaw that story alone may not provide. They help us move from, I have a sense of your pain, to, I understand enough of the detail to make good decisions about supporting you to stay safe. For example, sometimes we normalize the experience. Many people in your situation notice thoughts about ending their life. Has anything like that shown up for you at all? So normalization softens shame and says, you're not alone in this. Sometimes we use shame attenuation, which is a similar technique, but instead of speaking in generalities, it turns directly to the person's own pain as the gateway. Given everything you have been carrying, what thoughts, if any, have you had about ending it? And if the answer is no, we might gently check again, not even briefly. You'd be surprised how often that second invitation opens the door. There are times when clarity matters most, and that's when we use what's called the behavioral incident technique. We have touched on this many times over the last few episodes. We ask for descriptions rather than opinions. For example, how many pills did you take? After you left the kitchen, what happened next? So the first one was an example of fact-finding behavioral incident. The second one was an example of sequencing behavioral incident. And we always explain why. I'm asking step by step so I don't miss anything important for your safety plan. Another method is the gentle assumption. So instead of asking, have you ever thought about suicide? We might ask, what other methods, if any, have crossed your mind? So here, the wording assumes the thought might have been there and you might have even thought of methods, while still leaving space for a no. You can soften it by saying, if at all, at the end. Always use a gentle, soft tone of voice when using techniques like gentle assumptions. Remember, these are leading questions and there are particular cohorts, particular populations where you will not use them, populations that are suggestible. So people who might have intellectual difficulties, people with borderline personality disorder, children and adolescents as well. So you will not use certain techniques. There's also denial of specific, where we go through the potential methods one at a time. Have you thought of overdosing, hanging, drowning, shooting? We tell the person upfront, this might feel a bit tedious, but it helps me make sure I don't miss anything important. And finally, symptom amplification, which is used a fair bit in drugs and alcohol. It's used when minimization is likely. So instead of asking, do you think about suicide often? We might say, on the tougher days, do suicidal thoughts take up most of the day? Maybe 80%, maybe 60%. Putting a number is really important. How many times have you thought of suicide in the last 24 hours? 10 times, 8 times, less than 5. The person can then scale it back honestly. No, not that much. Maybe about half the day. The trick is to keep the tone curious, never incredulous. Of course, these techniques, as I was saying, require care. They are not for every context. Remember, with children, people in highly suggestible states, as I mentioned, those living with long-standing suicidality like borderline personality disorder, these strategies can risk doing harm. So in those moments, we step back to gentler tools, motivational interviewing, reflection, open questions, and patient presence. So you see, narrative and validity techniques are not opposites. One offers the story, data with a soul. The other brings clarity, data with a map. So you can fill in the blanks. Woven together, they help us walk that line between being present enough to the heart to hear it and precise enough to protect life. However, there are times when time is short. And this is where Before Now comes in, where we are weaving story into structure. This is what we call time window scaffold to get a sense of the full story in very limited time. This may be the emergency department or triage, or when a person's memory feels scattered and fragmented. We need a way to hold both the story and the structure. So that's where Before Now framework comes in. It gives us 5 simple windows into time, each one a frame that helps us weave narrative with clarity. The first window is day 1, the day of the attempt or the decision to act or the decision to seek help. We ask gently, from the moment you woke up that day, what happened? Step by step, take us through. The goal here isn't opinion or interpretation, it's description. We are trying to see the sequence, to spot the markers of intent, the planning, the small acts of concealment, the final gestures that often tell us how close the person came to crossing the threshold. This is very similar to sequencing behavioral incident or fact-finding behavioral incident. Then we move to the 2-week window, the lead up. Will you walk me through the 2 weeks before that day? What shifted? What changed? This is where we catch the pattern, how often suicidal thoughts arose, how long they stayed, whether the person could control them, and whether there were rehearsals or near misses. If means were considered, this is when we may need to carefully name them one by one so nothing gets overlooked. The third time window stretches wider, 3 months back. How did the pain intensify over the past few months? So we're looking at the etiological grid. Here the person can tell us about the buildup of stresses, the sense of entrapment or hopelessness, the way their mental health rose or fell, the moments that helped and the moments that harmed. This is where we begin to see not only the crisis, but the context. The fourth time window is simply called before. Has it ever been this bad? Have there been previous attempts? Past attempts matter because they show us what the person has already survived and what acquired capability they have and they have acquired along the way. They also remind us that even in the darkest chapters, recovery has been possible before and it can be again. And finally, we return to now. We always end with the now. Compared to that day, where are you right now? The reason this window comes last is deliberate. Risk shifts during the very act of telling the story. Sometimes intent rises as painful memories surface. Other times it softens as the person feels understood. That's why we circle back, once trust has been built, to ask about immediate safety, their current intent, their access to means, and whether care needs to be stepped up or stepped down. So, if you have begun with the here and now, remember to circle back to the here and now again. So it needs to be done twice so that you have covered off what might have been brought up during the assessment process itself, whether that be an escalation in risk or a decrease in it. But even with a good framework, there are pitfalls, and we need to name them. Sometimes we lean too far into the heart and forget the map. We validate beautifully, we empathize deeply, but we walk away without a plan. Other times we swing the other way, all map, no heart. We fire off rapid questions, gather facts, and the person shuts down. Or we fall into cannon questions, rattling off 3 or 4 methods at once and get invalid data in return, as people only remember the last thing that you mentioned. Or maybe we carry a hidden agenda, asking questions that feel like control rather than care. Worst of all, sometimes we rush to reassurance, accepting, I will never do it again at face value, instead of asking, what's actually changed? And if a similar day comes, what exits can we find earlier? Each pitfall has a repair. Slow down, name your purpose, hold one thread at a time. Be willing to say the quiet part out loud. I'm gathering these details so we can make the best decision together about what support is right for you, where it's offered, and how often we should connect. That honesty, far from pushing people away, usually deepens trust. And then woven into all of this is the step up and step down conversation. We might ask, have you felt closer to the edge lately? What would tell you it's time to increase support? Or on the other side, are there signs that suggest you can safely take a little more space? Where do you feel stronger than last month? These questions calibrate care, letting the person and the assessor adjust the weave together. Because assessment isn't just about information, it's about decisions. Who should be involved? A peer worker, a psychologist, a GP, a crisis team, a psychiatrist? Where should the support be based? In the community, intensive outpatient or inpatient? How often do we need to meet and for how long? What about safety specifics, means restrictions, 24/7 contact numbers, medication, crisis pathways? These are not abstract details. They are the scaffolding of safety. That's why I often say it loud. The details you have shared help me recommend the right level of support, who's involved, how often we meet, and the steps we will take together to keep you safe between visits. When we frame it like this, the assessment doesn't feel like an interrogation. It feels like collaboration. It feels honest. This is trauma-informed care. Before now is not just a structure. It's a way of showing that story and clarity can live side by side. The person offers their narrative, we listen. Then carefully we ask the question that completes the picture. Heart and brain woven together. So let's close the circle, right? So jigsaw complete, story held, relational safety is the soil, structured assessment is the seed. One without the other leaves us with either a beautiful conversation that changes nothing or a tidy form that no one trusts. Our craft is to name both needs, invite consent, and proceed with kindness and clarity. Now, with that stance in mind, we can revisit the phases of steps: fabric, thread, needle, tip, mend, and flow. So as we move through each, remember, our job is to trace what matters and to act on what's needed. So now let's revisit where we have been over the last 7 episodes. We began with fabric, the silent predispositions, fragile self, alienation, burdensomeness, rumination, inescapability, and curtains of despair. These are not failures of character, but conditions of cloth. They show how a person's life can become thin, worn, or strained long before a crisis appears. Fabric reminds us suicide prevention doesn't begin at the edge of the cliff. It begins at the seam, where the first threads are loosening. Then came thread, ideation. Suicidal thoughts don't usually arrive as fully formed plans. They whisper, they drift, they return and repeat. Thread captures that fragile stage when the mind begins to ask, would it be better if I went here? This is where clinicians and supporters must listen for the quiet signs, not wait for the dramatic ones. Because thoughts are already meaningful. They tell us something matters deeply enough to hurt. In needle, ideation sharpens into intention. Safe options fall away. Ambivalence narrows. The person begins to align thread and needle. A plan begins to take shape. This stage is dangerous precisely because it is quiet, subtle choices, giving things away, searching, rehearsing. They can be easily missed. Needle reminds us that intention is not always spoken, but it is often woven into behavior. Then came tip, the rupture, the suicide attempt itself. Tension builds, impact lands, and a postscript follows. This is sacred ground, not because the act was right or wrong, but because it shows just how tightly a person has been holding on. In tip, our task is not to judge, but to listen, to ask what pulled the thread so taut, and to understand the meaning inside the act. After tip comes mend, the post-attempt space. Survival does not mean closure. It means facing questions never rehearsed. Am I glad I lived? Do I still want to die? What does this attempt mean now? Mend gives us 4 lessons, meaning making, where intent is explored alongside values. Emotions in motion, where feelings surge and contradict. New stresses and supports as life resumes with added weight and new anchors. Direction forward, where the smallest stitch of purpose can begin a new pattern. Mend reminds us repair is never about hiding the tear. It's about honoring it and choosing to stitch anyway. Finally, flow, life in motion. Weeks or months after survival, when the person begins to live again, not smoothly, but with awareness. Flow invites us to notice fluctuations in mood and risk, learning from setbacks and successes, openness to support and change, what if and if then planning, the safety nets that make space for next time. Flow is not closure, it is continuation, a rehearsal of life, imperfect but alive. So we've spoken about these phases in theory. The theory comes alive in lived experience. So before we close, let's hear how Ari has begun to weave her own story back together, looking back on each step in her own words. Ari sat on a balcony one evening, a month after her discharge. The air was cool, the street below humming with the ordinary sounds of life. She opened her journal, the same one she had scribbled in before her attempt, and began writing for the first time not in fragments but in paragraphs. She wrote about her fabric. I used to think my sadness was weakness, but now I see it was the weight of carrying too much too quietly. I felt invisible even to myself. That was the fabric that wore thin. She wrote about her thread. The first time I thought about dying, it didn't feel dramatic. It was just tiredness. Thoughts that whispered, not shouted. I see now they were the first loose threads, asking me to notice the pain underneath. She wrote about her needle. When the thoughts sharpened into plans, I felt both terrified and relieved. Terrified because I knew where I was heading, relieved because at least I could imagine an end. That was the moment I began lining up the needle, the pull between wanting out and still wanting life. She paused, her hand shaking slightly before continuing. She wrote about her tip. The attempt itself wasn't a storm. It was quiet. I thought I was making the final stitch, but instead the cloth tore. And yet, I was still there. I am still here. A rupture, yes, but not the end. She wrote about her mend. Those first days after, I didn't know if I was grateful or ashamed. Both, I guess. Some days I felt regret, other days possibility. Slowly, I began to see the attempt not just as an ending, but as a mirror. It showed me what mattered enough to almost take me. And finally, she wrote about flow. Now I notice more. The tightness in my chest, the days that feel heavier. I can trace the pattern sooner. I have learned what helps: a sketch, a text, a walk, a breath. I'm opening little by little to support, and I have made plans with the people who matter. If I spiral, then I'll reach. If I lose sleep, then I'll call. These are not chains, they are lifelines. Ari closed the journal and sat in silence. The cloth of her life was not seamless, but it was hers again, stronger in some places, tender in others. And as she traced the threads with her fingers, she whispered to herself, "I'm here, and that's enough. That's a start." Ari's words remind us continuation is not neat, but it is possible, and her story brings us back to the loom, to the truth that steps is not a staircase, but a weaving, which brings us to woven. So we return to the loom. Steps is not a linear staircase. People may cycle, stall, or skip, but it gives us language. It helps us locate where someone is. It reminds us that suicide prevention is not about fixing the cloth for them. It is about tracing the weave with them, noticing where it frays, listening to what matters most, and stitching beside them when the time is right. This is not just life-saving work, it is life-weaving work, life-honoring work. And now, before we move into the next aspect of steps and on to hope, we pause, because this story is not only Ari's, it belongs to all of us who have walked alongside pain as clinicians, carers, peers, family, or friends. So, in this summary episode, take a breath, reflect on the phases, notice what resonated, remember the moments in your own practice or your own life where threads have pulled tight. And remember, what hurts most is often tied to what matters most. This is why we listen. That is why we weave. In our closing reflections, we will move forward from steps to mindset shifts. So we will leave steps for now, not with a neat conclusion, but with a language for the journey. From fabric to flow, each phase has shown us that survival is never just about preventing death. It's about tracing the threads of what matters most and choosing stitch by stitch to weave them back in. We have walked with Ari and with each other through every phase of STEPS model, from that worn fabric of predisposition to the first frayed threads of suicidal thought, through the narrowing of intention, the rupture of action, the tender repair of mending, and finally the weaving forward of life in motion. But STEPS is not just a map of phases, it also asks us to shift our practice, to change the way we think and the way we listen. So in the next episode, we will explore these mindset shifts. The first is a shift from prediction to prevention, because suicidality is fluid, and what matters is not predicting the future with impossible accuracy, but building safety in the present and prevention into the days ahead. The second is a shift from past to future. While history matters, prevention is always forward-facing. We must ask not only what has been, but what may come next and how to prepare for it. The third is a shift from deficits to assets, because safety is not only about risk factors, it lives in the person's strengths, their coping strategies, their values, and the connections that hold them when the cloth feels fragile. Together, these shifts invite us to practice differently, and they sit alongside 4 guiding tasks within STEPS itself. And we will talk about that in the episode after the next one, to figure out which phase the person is in, to trace the sources of the emotional pain, to understand the span of their fluctuations from their lowest point to where they are now, and to explore scenarios of what the future might hold. These are the deeper lenses of STEPS, the ones that help us move from seeing only the tear to seeing the whole tapestry in motion going into the future. So, as we close this summary, let's hold on to this truth. Steps is not a staircase to climb once, it is a framework to return to, a way of orienting ourselves when the weave feels tangled. And in the next episode, we will lean into those practice shifts, exploring how clinicians, carers, and companions can ground themselves in prevention, in forward vision, and in strengths, so that the threads of safety can be stitched with even greater care. This will involve a shift from top to tap. But more about that in the next episode. Until then, have a wonderful week.
Every life begins mid-weave, not a blank page but thread and grief. Some threads shimmer, some hang loose, some are worn but still hold truth. In fabric the wear was quiet and deep. In thread the thoughts began to creep. In needle the plan took shape unseen. In tip the cloth split at the seam. Then came and a thread returned and flow where hope is slowly learned. Each step a shift, a sign, a scene, each one part of something unseen. Fade would phrase, breathe begins, needle sharpens, tip breaks in. Man remembers, flow breathes on, and through it all we stay drawn. Not to fix or force or bloom, but just to sit beside the loom. We are not the weavers of their cloth, but hands that notice what was lost. We don't tug the thread too tight, we don't push away the night. We ask what hurts and why does it hurt so much? What mattered once and can we still touch that thread, that meaning, that silent flame? The pain's not weakness, it speaks a name. The fragile thread, the quiet sigh, the thread through needle's narrowing eye. The tip, the tear, the breath that stayed, the stitch that healed, the hand that laid, the plan, the pull, the thread that bends, the silent signs that someone sends. They're not a mystery to decode, but signs of something once bestowed. Fabric 3, the needles pull, tip sharp point, then man made whole. Flow continues, still unsure, but still alive, still searching more. And us, we walk, not far, not fast, but with the thread that still holds past. We listen not to fix or prove, we simply sit beside the loom. To honor what was torn, to follow what still matters, to trace a thread with care, not shatter, to stitch beside, not stitch for them. This is not the end, this is when the